The grand illusion or just a bunch of confusion? My name's Joel Duff, and I just got done watching a Facebook Live presentation by Dr. Terry Mortenson in which he demonstrates his misunderstanding of human origins. There's so many things in that video to talk about, but I'm going to focus on just one slide and talk about a couple misconceptions that he has about the fossil record and human origins. So the talk is Ape-Men, the Grand Illusion. It was given on February 26th, which is today. And he is talking about contrasting models, right? He's contrasting the evolutionary tree or the evolutionary assumptions of how humans are related to great apes. And then he talks about the creation forest model in which the great apes are a separate creation from man. There's two things I want you to note. First of all, he doesn't represent the evolutionary tree correctly. So he's presenting to his audience what evolutionary biologists believe, and yet he tells them something that really, he shows them something that really isn't an accurate portrayal of the situation. So you'll notice right here what he has is he has gorillas and chimpanzees being related to each other by a common ancestor. And then you have to go back farther in time to find a common ancestor here that branched off into the various hominid fossil species and then eventually to Homo sapiens. So the way it looks on this particular tree is that there is a common ancestor to a lineage that later on divided and turned into gorillas and chimpanzees. I don't know of any evolutionary biologist or textbook from the last 20, 30 years that would illustrate it this way. Usually the way it is viewed is it's almost always shown, and there's a lot of different data sources that would suggest this, that you have Homo sapiens and you have chimps and you might have bonobos. No, I don't even know why I'm writing. And then you have gorillas and you have orangutans. And it would almost always show that it does, the modern view of the relationships of these different organisms is that chimps and humans share a more recent common ancestor than they do with gorillas. That's not what is being shown in this particular tree. Now, I don't know if Terry Mortenson actually knows what the conventional view is, but he is presenting to his audience a non-conventional view. It just so happens that this non-conventional view makes it seem like chimps and gorillas are more different than humans than if you were to show it in the conventional way, which shows chimps and humans being more similar to one another than they are to their other great apes. So that's item number one. He's not presenting the evolutionary view correctly, and so when he contrasts the evolutionary view with his creation forest, he is drawing an inappropriate contrast between the two, falsely making it look like chimpanzees and gorillas are much more closely related to each other than any evolutionary biologist would say that they are. Second, I want to point out something about the creation forest view. So in the creation forest view, you start out here, this is creation down here, all right? And at the moment of creation, all right, on the sixth day of creation, you have the origin of human beings, and those human beings then, those human beings have persisted through time to today's Homo sapiens that are alive today, but also you have Neanderthals and maybe Homo erectus as fossil species or variants of human beings that are all part of the humankind. Then he is saying that creationists, and here's the quote right from his presentation, creationists think that the orangutan is one kind of an ape, chimps and gorillas and maybe Australopithecines are another kind of ape. And that's what he's showing here. He's showing that orangutan, God created orangutans, and then they have persisted to the present. And he also shows that chimpanzees and gorillas share a common ancestor and so are one kind, and maybe they also include a bunch of these older 4 million year old, in their mind 3,500 year old fossils of Australopiths, and they're all actually one kind, which is this other ape kind. Now, when I saw this, I had to scratch my head, and I thought, what creationists is he talking about? Has he even visited the Creation Museum, which he's a member of Answers in Genesis, which is the parent organization of the Creation Museum, because this is not the view of his own organization or other people in his own group. Does he keep up with that literature? I'm not so sure. He's talking outside of his area of expertise, clearly using slides he's been given, and that's part of the problem, is that he is perpetuating a whole bunch of misconceptions. Partly the original slides he's given, this one's just incorrect, but other slides he's given maybe have correct information on them, but he doesn't understand the information well enough, and then when he talks about it, he's giving his audience a spin on that, which even some of his own creationist fellows would disagree with. All right, so what I want to do is I want to show you, why I'm perplexed about why he would make this statement that orangutans are one kind of ape and chimps and gorillas are another. Oh, let me point out one other thing too. Over here he's got Homo habilis, but he doesn't put it into this image over here. Homo habilis is actually disputed among creationists as to whether it's a man or whether it is an ape. And the other thing that's missing here is, where is the hobbit? Homo floresiensis, or what about Homo naledi, or some of the other fossils that have been found in the last 10, 15 years. He does not put them on these two charts, just like most creationist organizations kind of ignore those fossils, and the reason they ignore them, or I shouldn't say they ignore them, they just don't present them in these types of general talks to general audiences. And I think the reason they don't is because they can't agree whether they're human fossils or whether they're ape fossils. So as much as Terry Mortenson tries to portray a very clear difference between these two groups, and he spends the rest of the 30 minutes of his talk talking about how obvious it is that human beings are not great apes. And yet there are fossils for which some creationists say clearly they're great apes, and other creationists look at the exact same fossils and say clearly they're human beings. So his suggestion that it's easy and that it's obvious, I think at one point he even suggests that any 5-year-old child would be able to easily know the difference between a chimp and an ape, as if it's so clear that anybody could figure it out. And yet the expert creationist can't decide if something is an ape or a human being, suggesting that this is not as simple as he makes it seem. Okay, so how do I know that Terry Mortenson is not very well informed about his own organization's viewpoint on this topic? All right, and I don't know where he got this figure, whether he made this figure himself. I haven't seen these two figures before, and like I said, this figure is just wrong in how it's presented. This one is also wrong because I don't know any creationists that actually represent it this way. So where he got this idea, who gave him this slide, I would be really interested to find out. So how do I know that he's wrong about in this particular view? Well, Gene Leitner, who has done a lot of work for Answers in Genesis independently, wrote this I'll say it's a really important paper because it's referred to all the time by the Ark Encounter and Answers in Genesis, and it's in their own Answers Research Journal here from 2012, so that's now 9 years ago. And based on her other paper, Determining the Ark Kind, she's interested in understanding what is a biblical kind, and that's what he's addressing here. He's saying that God made kinds. That's his whole argument in his presentation. And he's saying that there's an orangutan kind, there's a chimp and gorilla kind, and then there is a human kind. What does Gene Leitner say about this? Well, if we go down to her section on the apes and, primates, she divides the primates into a variety of different kinds. And one of the kinds is, let's see here, the great ape kind. And what does she include in the great ape kind? Well, first of all, she notes that conventional biologist or conventional classification puts the human beings into the great apes. And then, but she has to note that there are significant differences between us and the apes compared to some of the differences between other families. So this seems ludicrous, all right? So again, it's ludicrous to put humans in along with apes. Therefore, this older designation is being used here, and what she says is that there are 3 genera and 6 species in this family, which include the gorilla, the chimpanzee, and the orangutan. So she places those 3 organisms into the same group called the great ape kind, which is an indication that she believes that God created one kind of great ape, which has then diversified into chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. This is further bolstered by the fact, and I think this, based on her research and that particular paper, Answers in Genesis as an organization, I would say, has taken the position that orangutans are just a great ape kind, not a separately created kind, as Terry Mortenson had suggested. And you might think that's just a trivial mistake, but it does make a big difference. And I'm just a little bit at a loss for how creationists can't seem to get their act together in terms of being consistent on these things. I mean, they talk about how kinds are not that hard to figure out, although I've talked a lot about how it is kind of confusing. But and they've talked about how easy it is to determine the difference between an ape and a human being, but there seems to be a lot of controversy about exactly what makes up an ape. However, Answers in Genesis made a fairly bold statement about what they think apes are. They have a new display at the Creation Museum, and in it they show what they perceive to be the origin of the great apes. So here are the great apes. The great apes include orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. And if you trace back, those are the ones that are alive today, right? Those are the species that are alive today. There's also this gigantic, large ape that's extinct. And then, of course, you have Ardipithecus, and you have Paranthropus, I can't say that, and the Australopithecines, which there's a bunch of different potential species there. Now, if you trace all of these back, they have these little dotted lines which say, well, we're not exactly sure how they're related. However, we're pretty certain they're all related to one another. And not only that, but all of these great apes are related to one another to a common ancestor. And when did that common ancestor live? That common ancestor lived right here at the global flood, which is 4,350 years ago. So 4,350 years ago, there was just 2 apes. Those 2 apes then, as they had offspring, those offspring then diversified into orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. So remember, the conventional thought in terms of how they're related and how, I'll say, how similar they are to each other is biologists think that chimps and humans are more similar to each other than, say, chimps and orangutans are to each other. And that's why they would place humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans all in one group. What creationists are saying is that even though this is a highly diverse group with lots of variation between them, we're going to put all these together, and then we're going to say that humans are a special group. I'm not here to argue about how special humans are. I happen to think humans are pretty special and are a created kind. So, but let's not lose sight of the fact why conventional biologists would place all these in one group. There's plenty of reasons why they would do that. So Answers in Genesis is putting all of these things together into one group and saying they all originated from one common ancestor. Now, that wouldn't be the original ancestor because that was the global flood. Those are just the 2 apes that were preserved by the flood. They would say before the flood there was an original great ape that God created in the 6-day creation on the 6th day. And they suggest that maybe that great ape diversified into a number of different species. And then at the flood, God chose just 2 representatives of all this diversity, and then they became all this diversity again. Now, of course, there's absolutely no record of fossils from before the flood. So that's why all these dotted lines. They have no evidence of the presence even of any apes at all before the flood, because there's no fossils in the fossil record of what they call global flood deposits. All these fossils are in sediments that came after the flood, and so represent the descendants of these two apes that were presumably on Noah's Ark. Now, I have to nitpick on another thing while I'm here, and that is they're showing Ardipithecus, and Ardipithecus is definitely able to stand upright. Most images shown of Ardipithecus would be upright walking. It was probably a combination of upright walking between trees, but also fairly adept at being in trees, this particular species. And the reason I nitpick on this is because they're not showing the typical way that this is being shown. They talk about, like Terry Mortenson talks about, we have all the same data, right? We all have all the same evidence. We can see the same things. We just have different interpretations of that. The evidence is that this is upright walking and not walking, not be a knuckle walker. I think they're presenting it this way because it's a possible interpretation of sometimes that particular animal walking that way. And they don't want to show an upright walking animal as having been derived from a common ancestor that was, like this. I think this is a funny looking ape myself. But they don't want to make it look like, upright walking could have evolved from walking on all fours. Because that might make it seem like human beings could derive an upright stature from an ape-like ancestor. The other thing that's missing here is they don't have Homo naledi, they don't have Homo habilis, there's a bunch of other fossils here which are well known from the last 15 years that are generally ignored, again, by creationists, not placing them on this tree. And that's partly because they don't know where to put them. They don't know where to put them on the other tree of the human origin tree or the ape origin tree. And again, that just shows how difficult it is to parse these two things and how difficult it is to define a kind. Where's the boundary of a kind? If kinds truly are separately created things that can have no relationship with one another because God created them separately, why is it there are so many different organisms that are difficult to place because they seem to straddle those various kinds? And that's the challenge the young earth creationists are faced with when they have to think about kinds. Okay, so I think that's all of my complaints about this particular figure from Terry Mortenson's talk. Like I said, there's many other things in the talk that are similarly, I would have similar issues with. But this in particular, just showing a correct phylogeny to represent who you disagree with, I think is an important thing to do. And then to actually understand your own literature from your own organization and represent it in your talk, I think also is important to do. If you're trying to present to a general audience the big picture of what an evolutionary and creationist model is, I think they should both actually represent the evolutionary and creation models. I think that's not too much to ask. All right, thanks for listening.